Hello and welcome to my Why Use R video. I've been wanting to put together a tutorial on R to kind of give back to the community a bit, but I realized I kind of need to go back a step and explain to people what it's good for. So this is some overview and some case studies that will hopefully help you to see where R might be helpful to you and how you might be able to use it. So we're going to give you an overview of why you might use R, and then we're going to do some examples, exploratory data analysis, some plotting, some data manipulation, and talk about reproducibility. I'm then going to jump into a few advanced features like cloud computing, GIS, and web applications, and then compare it to some other commonly used software and tools. So why use R? For me, it's because it can do more, and so I now rarely use Excel or SPSS anymore because I can do everything I need in R and do it faster and quite often better. But most of what I like about it are the more advanced features. So here are a few more concrete examples. So one is some data exploration, some plotting. We're going to look at reproducibility, and then we're going to get to the advanced features. But the thing is, it can be a bit scary at the start. R was the language of choice for my data science course, so I was highly motivated and given good tuition to get me over that initial learning curve. But hopefully this presentation is going to be super compelling to get you over that initial learning curve and give you some motivation to get started. So the first thing we're going to look at is a bit of exploratory data analysis using some WIM data. So WIM data is way in motion. It is a device that measures a vehicle's mass as it drives over it. I've got there a bit of R code on the left, and I've got an example plot on the right, but we're actually going to jump into R and produce this plot and a few other bits and pieces to help us understand this data set a bit better. So this is RStudio, and if you're going to use R, make sure you get RStudio. To give you a brief overview of the window, this is the script window, and what you can see here is actually more or less the presentation I'm giving that I wrote. I actually wrote in R. It's an R Markdown file. Down the bottom we've got a console window. Top right is where our environmental variables are, and this window here you can use for help, and it's where the plots might show up if you're using it a bit differently. But let's jump straight into generating that plot. So the first thing we're going to do is read in our data set. I'm using Command Enter, or if I was on a PC it would be Control Enter to run this line by line. So we've just read in that data set, so we can see a variable up in this top right window and see that we've got 92,000 records. So it's not a small data set. But to get an overview, we're going to look at the names of all the variables. So we've got some date, we've got a code, we've got GMC, which is the vehicle mass, which is what we're initially going to look at. And where's the other one that I want to use? Config. We're going to use that in a moment, and that is explaining what sort of vehicle it is by its axles. So that histogram we saw in the presentation is just this single function here, hist. And so histogram is really good to get an overview of our data. So if we go Command Enter, we have the histogram. We've got the GCM, which is the gross combined mass along the bottom, and we've got the number of vehicles in each of these mass bins going along. To get a bit more detail, we can modify it slightly and say that we want 75 bins rather than the default number of bins, and we can see a little bit more detail. Now, because I have worked with this data a lot, I can notice that I've got some vehicles up around this 150 ton mark, which not many vehicles, but they are there, and that doesn't quite seem right. So I can dig a bit deeper by looking at a summary of that particular variable, the GCM variable. And I can see that there's a minimum of 0.2 tons and a maximum of 145 tons, which is way more than there should be. We generally wouldn't expect vehicles over 100 tons. And we can also get the median and the mean and the quartiles there, if that's of use. So I now have a bit of an understanding that I've got a few very high vehicles in this mass variable. So what we can do is we can perform a subset that just looks at the vehicles that are over 100 tons to see if something seems odd about the data. So this is the configuration, looking at the number of axles in each of the axle groups. And now a 1, 2, 3, 3 vehicle, that's a B double, and that's a very common type of vehicle. And there's another 1, 2, 3, 3. But this has been recorded as a single vehicle, whereas it looks like it's actually two separate vehicles. So that might be a particular vehicle we need to filter out of our data set. And when we come over here, we have another 1, 2, 3, 3, and then we have a 1, 2, 3. And that 1, 2, 3 is also a really common vehicle. But this combination of vehicles just doesn't exist. So in much the same way as we were able to filter this data set and look at the configuration for vehicles over 100 tons, we could also filter them out really easily. So let's quickly jump back to the presentation. So that's our first quick example of data exploration. We can read in a data set, get an overview of the variables, draw up some histograms, or generate some summary statistics to get a very quick idea of what is going on with our data set. We're going to dig a little bit deeper using another part of the same data set. So the steer axle on the 1, 2, 3 heavy vehicle that we saw just a moment ago is sometimes used as a calibration measure for one of these WIM sites because it doesn't change much even when the vehicle is loaded. So we're going to flick over to R and look at this analysis there. Okay, so this is us. This is where we want to be. Okay, so we're going to create a new data set from our original WIM data set that just looks at the 1, 2, 3 vehicles. So we form a subset and write it to a variable, and now we have this new config 1, 2, 3 variable. So we can actually look at this by clicking on it up here, and we have our data set. So there's the GCM variable, there's our axle mass variables, and all these other variables that we're mostly not going to be using. So let's close that down and get rid of the console again. Okay, so we can draw up the histogram just like we did above, but now looking at axle mass 1 only. So we get the number of vehicles and add the axle mass along the x-axis. But we can also tweak this histogram function a little bit. So we talked about changing the number of bins before, so that's what that does. This changes it from a frequency to a density, and then we're adding a title and an x-axis label. Sorry, I skipped over this part. To make this a little more interesting, we're going to calculate a density function. So the area under a density curve is equal to 1. Rather than using a frequency statistic like we have here. So we're going to run that, and we are going to generate a density function. And then we're going to run the histogram again, like I mentioned before, and we're going to add a line that is the density function to it. So now we have the same graph that we had in our presentation, where we have a histogram with all the bins, but we've also added a density function. Now the reason that density function is useful is that we can find out what the maximum of that density function is, and then find out what axle mass that is at, because that's how we can determine whether that WIM site is working properly. So very quickly we discover that the maximum density is at 5.8, which is about where we want it for a properly calibrated WIM site. So there's a quick examination of doing some subsets and some additional functions to get a bit more out of our data. Okay, moving on. We're going to look at the iris dataset. Now the iris dataset is built into R, and it is based on iris flowers, and it's used to do practice classification type thing. It's often used for machine learning. Alright, so we can see a couple of R functions and the plots of a couple of those, but let's just jump across to R and have a bit more of a look. So earlier we used the summary function to look at a single variable, and we got the max and the min and the quartiles of that, but we can also use it to look at an entire data set. So when I run the summary function, we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 variables with species for iris species, and then various different aspects of the petal, of the flower size, so the petal length, the petal width, the sepal length and the sepal width. And these are used, so the theory is you use these attributes of the flower to try and classify what species it is. So there we get a very quick overview of the data, and as before we have the min and the max and a few other summary statistics for each of those variables. Species is a factor variable, so it just tells us the number of each of the species in this data set. So when you have a data set like this, it's possible to get a very quick overview of how the variables correlate with each other using this plotting function called pairs. And what this does is it plots each of the variables against one another. So in this column, everything in this column on the x-axis is the sepal length, and everything in this column is the width and the petal length and the petal width and the species groups. So we can see that between the petal length and the petal width, which is either this box here or this box here, there's a really strong linear correlation. Whereas between, say, the sepal length and the sepal width, it's not quite as clear and a bit all over the place. And then the other cool thing you can see is that in some of these cases, when you look at the species, like petal width and species, you can see there's very little overlap in the petal width, which is along the x-axis here. Certainly between this species here and the others, it's quite segregated. So it gives an overview of variables that might help you to design your classification algorithm. And if we go back to our presentation, we added a few other little things in this where we added a line of best fit, and we also cut out half the boxes because they're actually just duplicated over that over this center line running diagonal. But otherwise it is the same plot with a title. Another really common data set that's used in R is this MT-Cars data set. And it's a data set of vintage cars, different makes and models, and it also gives you a whole lot of information about them. So we're going to use this to look at another lot of plotting. So that the previous slide, we were looking at plotting with the base plotting system, but I wanted to introduce you to ggplot, which is a fantastic plotting library that I use almost every day. So let's come back across to R, and so we load the ggplot library like that. And let's have a quick look at MT-Cars, and this is the data set we're using. We can see all these cars down this side, and we've got the miles per gallon, the number of cylinders, the displacement, the horsepower, weight, quarter second, and we're going to start by looking at the horsepower and the quarter second times for these vehicles. So this is the ggplot. We're using the MT-Cars data set. Our x-axis is going to be horsepower and our y-axis is going to be quarter second, and we're going to do a point plot. And so there is our chart. It's a pretty uninteresting one, but it gives us a good look at our data, and you can see already that as the horsepower increases, we tend to have a decrease in the quarter second time. So that's kind of cool. So we're going to dig a little bit deeper into this, and we're going to add another variable that we can visualize. So we're going to add color equals cylinder, and I've got to add a little bit to convert it to a factor, but that's not a big issue. So if we plot that, we can now see our vehicle's horsepower, our vehicle's quarter second time, and the number of cylinders that the vehicle has using the color. So I've got that legend over on the right there, so 4, 6 and 8 cylinder cars. One of the other variables we have is also to indicate whether the car is an auto or a manual. So what we can do is we can generate a separate plot for all the cars that are automatics and all the cars that are manuals. So let's plot that again, and we've used this thing called faceting, where we now have I believe it is automatic cars are 0 and manual cars are 1. I can't remember, you've got to look up the data for that. But we can split them very, very quickly to see if there is a different relationship for automatic cars to manual cars. And what do we do next? Okay, so this is the same plot exactly, but we've just added some titles and some labels, and it looks like auto was 0 and manual was 1, which we've used this label here. So that is the ggplot library. We can very quickly do a quick XY plot using 2 variables, but then we can add several other layers of variables on top that can help us to visualize really complex large data sets very quickly just by adding another line of code. We can also write this to a variable. So we just wrote that to the variable g, and you can see over here that we now have a value g, and if we wanted to plot that again, not f, g, we can just type g, and there's our plot. So this was our plot without faceting, and you'll see why in a moment. So back to our presentation. ggplot, it's a very powerful plotting tool that creates plots that are really good for presentations and to go straight into reports. In case what we just did didn't create nice enough plots, there are lots and lots of themes built in, so you can very quickly change the look of your plot. So here's one with the theme black and white, and here's another one with the theme minimal. There's also some other packages that give you even more options. So there's a library called GG Themes that creates a whole bunch of other different visualizations. So Tufty on the left here, he was a very well-known data visualization expert, and the WJS on the right actually stands for Wall Street Journal's, for Wall Street Journal. So this is a particular style that can make your plot look like something that came out of the Wall Street Journal. So that's really cool. So while simple is good, sometimes it's important to take a look at a lot of data at once, which is why visualizations are so important. And while this graph takes quite a while to get your head around, it was created for a very specific purpose. I was working on a Kaggle project that was investigating Kiva microloan data, and I just couldn't get my head around the data. There were so many seemingly conflicting variables, and so this graph took 4 of those variables and brought a lot of clarity to tell me what was going on. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time explaining this graph, but all at once, it can tell me the range of values of a loan for a particular sector. So the sectors are across the bottom. The box plot tells me the range and the median and the sort of upper and lower limits of what the loan values for that sector was. And I can also see very quickly in blue the number of loans in each of those sectors. And across the top in the different shade of green, we can find out the total value of the loans in each of those sectors. Because some sectors had some really high value loans but very few loans and things like that, it was really hard to understand the data without actually putting it all together like this that allows you to see it all at once. So sometimes really custom graphics are worthwhile, and it took me quite a while to set this up, but it was enormously valuable once I did. And that was all created with ggplot. As I was writing this presentation, I discovered another package which is heavily based on the ggplot, but it's designed to give publication-ready plots. And while I really like this, it just goes to show that there are many, many packages out there, and if you keep digging, there will be a package for just about anything you want to do. So this is another plot of the MT cars package, looking at weight and miles per gallon compared to each other, which gives a really nice, clean plot straight out of the box. Data manipulation. Now this is one of the areas that R really excels. And so I'm just going to jump across to R again so that we can look at each of these options or each of these functions. So scroll all the way down. We don't need that open. Alright, here we go. Sorry, my mouse has a bit of a jerky scroll, so sorry if I keep skipping past where we're going. Okay, I just need to run this little bit, I think. Yes. Sorry about that. I was missing my df variable. Okay, so we are using the mtcars package again to do a few little functions. So subsetting and filtering. Now we've already seen this in use a few times before, but well, first let's just look at our data set. So we're using the mtcars package that's now written to a separate variable. And we are going to apply a filter for all vehicles that have a carburetor have more than 6 carbies. We have two. We have a Ferrari and a Maserati. So with a single one-liner, we can very quickly look at the specific thing we want to look at. What we're going to do here is we're going to create another data frame that has two variables. It has the number of cylinders and cylinder name. So this is the new data frame, and it maps each of our cylinder numbers to a cylinder name. Because if we go back to our original data set, we have just a cylinder number. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a merge of our original data frame and our cylinder mapping data frame we just created by number of cylinders. So again, that is just a one-line function. We list our two data sets and hit merge. And you can see here that we have the number of cylinders down there, and all the way over on the right, we can't quite see it all on the one screen, we have our cylinder names over here. So our 4, 6 and 8 cylinders. So merging data sets in much the same way as you would in SQL becomes really simple and just a one-line function. Another really common data analysis technique is to aggregate. So we're going to aggregate via number of cylinders, and we are looking at a mean of each of our variables. Now some of our variables, like the name, we can't really get the mean of, but for our 4-cylinder cars we have an average of 26 miles per gallon, 19 for 6 and 15 for 8-cylinder vehicles, which is what we expect. It fits with the trend we saw earlier. So that's the aggregate function. We can also do loops in R, and this is one of its biggest advantages over Excel, I find, is that you can loop over data sets. So here we have a loop where we're looping with the numbers from 1 to 5, and I is going to take on those values, and we're just going to print them. So that is an extremely simple loop where we just print 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 using that little function. But loops are just incredibly powerful, and the more data analysis you use, the more you're going to use, the more you'll find you need them. We can also write simple functions in R, and again, here is a one-line function, and the function takes on X. It does some processing with X, and so we write that. It becomes a function stored in memory, and we can call it whenever we like. So we're calling this function with the value 5. We can call it with 3, and it just runs this computation, which is a simple quadratic function. Personally, I haven't had much use for something like this. However, functions are massively powerful, and again, the more data analysis you do, the more you will find them helpful. Alright, that's data manipulation. Now, reproducibility. Reproducibility is a concept I hadn't heard about before I'd started my data science course, but it's something that I think is massively important. So replication of experiments is really important in the field of science. It's where somebody does an experiment and they come up with a finding, and then somebody else will replicate that exact same experiment and see if they get the same finding. And when that happens lots of times and lots of people come up with the same answer, then it becomes generally accepted as being true, or quite likely to be true at the very least. But replication isn't always possible for a variety of reasons. So reproducibility ensures that your data methodology of analysis is recorded and can be tested, and people know what has happened. There's been lots of cases of people trying to, I guess, use data in ways that wasn't quite intended, and they come up with all these findings, but it's hard to know whether they're actually good and valid findings if you can't go back and check what they've done. So some ways to ensure reproducibility are to use scripting. like R as a scripting language, where your analysis steps are actually written down and recorded. To make it even better, if you incorporate instructions within that script, either by using something like R Markdown, like I've used for this particular presentation, or what you call comments in code, which are actually what these things are here. These are comments, things that don't get evaluated but tell me we're looking at subsetting or merging or aggregating. So incorporating instructions and explanations is very, very helpful for yourself, if for nobody else. The number of times that I've gone back to code and not been able to understand it because I haven't put in comments, and it's taken me ages to work through from the beginning again. Yeah, it happens all the time. But scripting allows you to put those explanations in there very clearly. And the other way to ensure reproducibility is to provide data. And R doesn't really help with that, except for the fact that it's very easy to read in data. So if you provide a data set along with your script, then somebody can exactly reproduce your analysis. Now we get to the fun stuff, because you can do more. Now, cloud computing. I recently ran into a problem at work where I didn't have enough RAM in my computer to do the analysis that I wanted. I was looking at about 100 million records of something, and our work laptops just wouldn't cut it. So what I was able to do was get onto Amazon and create an R processing server. So I could use my exact same R scripts that I used on my computer on a server that I could make as big as I like, use as much RAM as I wanted, and read from cloud storage really quickly and do all sorts of great things. So cloud computing is a really great reason to use R, or if you think you might need it. R actually has some really good geospatial aspects to it. So GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, which is one of my other passions. And R allows you to work with visualizations and data processing. So on the right here is actually a map I included in my Kaggle Kiva kernel. And this is a heat map of some loam data and the locations of that. And we can actually zoom in and look around with this particular module. There's other ways to plot that you can't do that, but this one is really great. You can also use this exact same window to create web applications. We can see this web app that I already have opened in another window. So let's go there now, because this actually takes quite a while to load. So we have this same zoomable interface, but we've also got some pop-ups. And we also have graphs that get updated when you click on different segments, I hope. It's not always super obvious because they can be quite similar. There we go. And so that's a web interface that is basically written in R. All right. And this little code block here is all you need to provide that map. Once you have that data set read in, this is the data set here, but once that is read in, it's just 4 or 5 lines of code and you have this interactive heat map of your data. So it's enormously powerful. Okay, so a quick comparison of different data analysis tools. So Excel is really great at data entry. It's also really good for looking at actual data values, and that's partly why it's good at data entry. But if you want to see the actual values as they relate to each other in cells next to each other, it can be really good for that. It generally works for small data, so for very large data sets it often struggles, although it's better than it used to be, but it has a very low barrier of entry. Pretty much everyone's seen Excel at some point, and because all your data is in front of you there, it becomes quite easy to use, so low barrier of entry. Where I find R really useful is for visualizations. So like we saw, it has some fantastic plotting packages. It's great for generating summaries of data, so where you don't need to look at the actual individual values in a cell, but you need to get an overview of the data. Generating those summaries, it does really well. So because of that, it's good for big data sets. It can manage much larger data sets. And I haven't even got into the fast read and write functions and that sort of thing, but even so, it was very quick to deal with even that 90,000 record data set we had. And for reproducible research, where we're looking at having scripting and all that sort of thing to record all the steps we've done in our analysis. So Tableau is another tool, and there's lots like it. It's either a web-based tool or you can actually download an application, but it's really good for interactive visualization. If you don't want to if you don't have any coding skills and don't want to learn coding skills, it can be a great way to interrogate data and generate visualizations. It can manage quite large data sets, and it's all based around being really easy to use. Python is something else that you might have heard of, particularly if you've been looking at data science things. And Python is very similar to R, or has a lot of the same advantages to R, let's put it that way. It has slightly broader applications. It's kind of more of a programming language in its own right, which can be helpful in some ways. But I find that because it has broader applications than being just a sort of a data analysis tool, it also has a slightly bigger learning curve. There's a few more bits and pieces you need to learn when you start out to use Python. So there's a brief overview, and hopefully that gives you a better understanding of all things R and how it might be useful to you. I'd really encourage you to have a go, open it up and try some tutorials. So that's it. I hope that was helpful and gave you a good overview of R and some of its benefits and where it might be of use to you. I hope to create some tutorials that might help you get going and ease that initial learning curve to get into things. So thanks for listening, and keep checking back for new videos.